Why is a human life worth saving? Why is it worth the trouble? Human life includes so much potential evil as well as good. It would hardly seem worth preserving at all, unless there is a specific, compelling reason for doing so. Traditionally, in Western culture, the life of a human individual has been regarded as very special. The fully developed view of the sanctity of human life in the West did not come from nowhere. It came directly from the Judeo-Christian consensus, which was the framework in the West for centuries. Based on biblical teachings, people used to view human life as unique, something to be protected and loved because it was made in the image of God. Until recently, in our own era, with some notable and sorry exceptions, human beings have generally been regarded as special, unique, non-expendable. However, in the West, in the second half of the 20th century, this high view of life is changing drastically. For instance, in some of today's hospitals, this child would be left to die. What would have been unthinkable just a few years ago is not only accepted today, but more and more being deliberately encouraged as a practical, utilitarian philosophy. Perhaps the most striking and unusual feature of our moment of history is the speed with which eras change. The thinkables of the next 2 decades may very well involve the acceptance of things which for most people today would seem totally unthinkable, unimaginable, immoral. We are moving swiftly from an era which placed the highest value on a human being to an era in which those values are increasingly ignored. For a growing number of people today, what is declared to be legal sets their only standard as to what is morally right. Why has our society changed? The answer is clear. The consensus of our society no longer rests upon a Christian base, but upon a humanistic one. Humanism is man putting himself at the center of all things, rather than the Creator God. Having rejected God, the humanist scientists taught that all reality is just one big machine. Men and women may be seen as more complicated mechanisms, but they're machines nevertheless. This causes people to view themselves differently and to have different attitudes toward other human beings. As an example of this thinking, in 1968, Dr. Edmund R. Leach, Provost of King's College, Cambridge University, wrote,
"Today, when the molecular biologists are rapidly unraveling the genetic chemistry of all living things, all the marvels of creation are seen to be mechanisms rather than mysteries. Since even the human brain is nothing more than an immensely complicated computer, it is no longer necessary to invoke metaphysics to explain how it works. In the resulting mechanistic universe, all that remains of the divine will is the moral consciousness of man himself."
By constant repetition, the idea that man is nothing more than a machine has infiltrated the popular mind. Year after year, the schools and the media have taught this idea, regardless of how unfounded and ungrounded is the hypothesis. Gradually, after being generally unquestioned, these ideas are blindly accepted. These erroneous ideas about mankind have serious effects. After all, it is us they're talking about. For a while, Western culture, by sheer inertia, continued to live by the old Christian ethics, while increasingly embracing the mechanistic view of people. This mechanistic view is that the universe is intrinsically and originally impersonal. By chance, life began. And then, through long periods of time, life became more complex, until man came into existence. By chance is meant that there was no reason for these things to occur. It just happened that way. No matter how this view is defended, it drastically reduces our value. Now, we are faced with a generation that has taken these theories out of the lab and the classroom and into the streets. Suddenly, we find ourselves in a more consistent but uglier world. More consistent because Western society is now really practicing this philosophy of man as a machine. And God, as a personal creator, is excluded from the picture. What is the consequence of putting these theories into practice? Let us consider some present realities, which would have been totally unthinkable even a few years ago. That is, totally unthinkable even upon the basis of the memory of a Christian consensus, let alone a Christian consensus itself. The humanistic philosophers tried to make ethics independent from the teaching of the Bible, with the present tragic results of the loss of humanness on all levels. The constant barrage of authoritative but unproven statements come from every side, and gradually people come to accept themselves and other people as machine-like things. If people are only a product of chance in an impersonal universe, there is no reason why mankind should be considered as special. The fact that human life is being devaluated is demonstrated by some of the major issues which are being debated by society today: abortion, infanticide, euthanasia. The whole concept of law is changing at the United States Supreme Court. When there was a Judeo-Christian consensus in our society, there was a basis for law. But now we live in a period of arbitrary sociological law. By sociological law, we mean that law only reflects the thinking of society at that moment. Or more accurately, that law is only that which a small group of men and women in some branch of government think is that which is for the sociological and economic good of that moment of history. Even the will and the moral judgments of the majority may be overridden. This change in the sociological law can change everything in life, including who should live and who should die. Those taking the lead in this movement, in the changes in regard to life and death, prefer to do so through the courts. It would be much more difficult to achieve these purposes through the legislators, who are elected by the majority of the people. Humanism is taking over. The old freedoms are running riot into chaos, and individuals are increasingly acting upon the logical conclusions of humanism and practicing their cruelties without restraint. Consider the unborn baby. In January 1973, the United States Supreme Court passed the abortion decision known as the Roe versus Wade ruling. Justice White of the Supreme Court, in his dissent to the abortion decision, called it an exercise of raw judicial power, an improvident and extravagant exercise of the power of judicial review. Upon this arbitrary ruling, medically and judicially, the Supreme Court invalidated the abortion laws of almost every state in the Union. With this Supreme Court ruling, the unborn baby is considered not to be a person. The issue of abortion is not one divided along religious lines, and it has nothing to do with the separation of church and state. Certainly it is not by any means uniquely the Roman Catholic issue that the pro-abortionists pretend. The right of people to exercise their view of life and death to those who represent them in the democratic processes and to be heard in the courts rests only on their being citizens and on being human beings. Abortion is not only a religious issue, it is a human issue. The fate of the unborn is the fate of the human race. We're all one human family, and thus when the rights of any part of that human family are denied, it's of concern to all of us. What is involved here is nothing less than the very essence of what true freedom and true rights are all about. Life is sacred, the first and most precious gift that God gives us. Any human life can, by the grace of God, be lived with fulfillment and with creativity, and in fellowship with other human beings, and in love and service to one's neighbor. The proponents of the humanistic philosophy, by the very nature of their philosophy, must take a view of life that is devastatingly different. Abortion on demand is another humanistic euphemism for man playing God. Its ramifications go beyond that callous tinkering of those who decide which babies will live and which babies will die. Its ramifications even goes beyond that very real pain which the unborn baby feels in the womb from the abortion techniques. The ramifications are lived out in the lives of millions of women, aborted mothers, who often, naive and frightened, have believed the abortion-on-demand propaganda that just a few hours in the abortion clinic will solve all their problems. But their motherliness is still there, even though at times they have been made barren psychologically or even physically for the rest of their lives. And then these actions flow on, from abortion on demand to death with dignity, the killing off of the unwanted babies and old people. We will look further into this in subsequent parts of this series. Whatever happened to the human race is being washed down the sink drains with the murdered remains of the unborn babies in today's hospitals. It is rushing headlong, heedlessly, into the unfulfillment and emptiness of the many women who will never be able to become mothers because their bodies have been violated by the suction tubes and the salt solutions of the abortionists. It is passively allowing ourselves to be thought of no longer as a multitude of divinely created beings, but rather merely as tinker toys, to be manipulated by the whim and will of the few. What can Christians and other concerned people do? First, we can have pity for the humanist with his barren view of mankind. And we can have deep feelings for the aborted babies themselves. And we can, through genuine support, prove to the pregnant woman who is considering an abortion that there are alternatives. And later in this series, we will go into these alternatives in depth. And then we can use our civic powers as citizens to protest and our power at the polls. But in the name of the God who has made all of life and all humanity, we must do something.